Okay, great. Good afternoon. I'm Rachel Glennerster, President of the Center for Global Development, and it's great to welcome everyone online and in the room to this event, what promises to be a great program about the world's largest bilateral development agency, the United States Agency for International Development. So, for nearly 25 years, CGD has worked to produce rigorous policy-oriented research and practical solutions that can be used by agencies like USAID to help them make more informed and effective decisions. In my own career, I've been, advocating for evidence-based policymaking both within government as a user of evidence and outside as a producer of evidence. But that lesson has taught me that going from informed, evidence-informed policy is easier to say than it is to do. So I want to take just a couple of minutes to give my own take on how USAID has changed on this particular metric of using evidence to make more informed decisions. And the first example, which we were just talking about outside, is very dear to my heart, which was the enhancement of the Office of Chief Economist as a center within the agency to really push for the use of cost effectiveness and evidence-based programming within the agency to understand what works and what doesn't and why, and to really make sure that that evidence changes what USAID does. Now, as Chief Economist myself of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office for a while, I saw how a unit inside the bureaucracy with a strong mandate and resources can help the agency make tough decisions on how to spend its resources. It was great to see this group attract a really accomplished team. I've watched them, really push the agenda within the agency and, most importantly, lead to the scale-up of highly effective policies across the agencies. So now, obviously, they are only one group within the agency that does evidence-based policymaking. Another area where it's been great to see USAID really respond very rapidly to the evidence is on the new evidence about the importance of lead poisoning in reducing the health and education of children around the world. This is a huge problem with, 1 in 3 children around the world having elevated levels of lead in their blood, but very, very little had been done for, in the historic past about this problem. Partly because we didn't have a really good overview of the evidence. But in 2003, CGD conducted a systematic review, pointing out, for example, that a fifth of the gap between the learning levels in rich and poor countries could be attributed to lead in the blood. So just a year later, USAID has launched, become part of an international partnership to tackle this problem, committed significant resources, and is well on the way to doing some really important work. So sort of responding very rapidly there to the evidence. Administrator Power has always been an important campaigner for refugees and those caught in protracted crises. In its work, USAID has taken on board the important research findings that clearly show that while you want to give refugees immediate assistance, it's as important for them and for the host communities to do things like extend labour market access to refugees and enable their integration into the local economy. But this would not be CGD if I was only complimentary. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things where I think there is still room for improvement. One, again, something that I've worked on is pandemic. So we saw a huge, cost to development of pandemics, and yet we really have struggled to maintain the political support for pandemic preparedness as, that experience recedes. As extreme weather events exacerbated by changing climate are threatening lives and livelihoods around the globe, we still don't have enough funding of cost-effective interventions to bolster adaptation. And I think that's partly on the researchers' side, that we haven't done a lot of work on showing what is the most cost-effective in that area. A third area where I think we've, and maybe you'll talk to this, is a huge problem, I think, is as lawmakers in the US and Europe look to understand how development investments can contribute to their geostrategic position, we need to make sure that those investments still work for the poor in low and middle income countries. So the elusive win-win that we're all looking for. Now, our speaker today brings a uniquely informed perspective to these challenges. Before leading USAID, Administrator Power served as US Ambassador to the United Nations. Her career has included stints as a journalist, beginning as a war correspondent in Bosnia, as an academic, where we actually, I think, overlapped at Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Law School. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author who has written extensively about the role of the US leadership in confronting global challenges. As the first USAID administrator to serve as a member of the National Security Council, she's worked to elevate development alongside diplomacy and defense as core pillars of US foreign policy. Following her remarks, she'll be joined on stage by Andrea Mitchell, NBC News' chief foreign correspondent and chief Washington correspondent, for a discussion on the future of USAID and development assistance in an increasingly complex world. Please join me in welcoming Samantha Power.
Hello, everybody. It is great to be here. I want to thank Rachel for her leadership, congratulate her on filling such an important role, and really such a perfect person to lead this institution, bringing her governmental experience, trying to make assistance more effective out in the world, and then marrying it with the incredible talent here at CGD and all of the diversity of thought and critical thinking that goes on here. CGD's research and advocacy have made a profound difference, and they have made development investments around the world smarter and more impactful. I will come back to the topic of lead, which is just one area where the Center for Global Development has left its mark, and that will be something you will continue to see this institution and the thinkers here, their impact playing out over time, and that's just one issue. For the past year, Russia's intelligence services have been backing a new information agency called African Initiative. This agency runs a website and social media accounts that consistently attack US health programs across the continent of Africa. These are health programs that, as people in this room know, in recent decades have helped turn the tide against diseases like HIV and malaria and save tens of millions of lives. This site repeatedly publishes baseless claims that these programs are in fact covertly carrying out nefarious biological testing on African communities. Meanwhile, in Sudan, as USAID surged humanitarian relief in response to the devastating civil war that has left millions on the brink of famine, outlets backed by the People's Republic of China have published articles falsely claiming that this life-saving humanitarian aid was politically motivated and infringing on Sudanese sovereignty. In Solomon Islands, a Russian state-backed outlet published an article wrongly claiming that USAID had attempted to orchestrate an electoral coup. A PRC-backed outlet then amplified similar claims. Now, I know some of this kind of activity is very familiar to folks here, but this is a very concerning trend, honestly. It is a growing frequency of false attacks against USAID from those who work against US interests and, frankly, the interests of development around the world. Since July alone, we have tracked at least 81 such foreign propaganda campaigns targeting USAID's work in local languages in every region of the world. So again, I don't share this development just because it is alarming, although it is, as it can endanger our programming, including life-saving programming, and even the lives of our staff. But I also share it because it reveals something profound. America's adversaries understand the enormous power of the United States' work on the ground to strengthen economies, democracies, and institutions. They get it. They see how USAID's partnerships with communities and governments help build critical supply chains and open up new markets for American businesses. They see how our work increases U.S. standing and helps strengthen alliances, which in turn strengthen our security in an age when so many of the biggest threats we face, like emerging pathogens or dangerous new technologies or toxic levels of pollution, transcend borders. These alliances matter for really pragmatic reasons. And they see how USAID improves democratic governance, making it harder for autocrats to exploit nations for their resources, making it harder for them to control the flow of information and silence those who dare to stand in their way. Ultimately, our strategic competitors recognize that USAID, with our deep network of partnerships in communities, businesses, and governments, is America's foreign policy ground game. They understand that this ground game is invaluable to advancing the security and the prosperity of the United States and our partners. Now, I wanted to start with this because we in the United States should appreciate not just that our global investments are increasingly getting under the skin of our strategic competitors, but we should appreciate why. We are seeing increased pressure on our work because we are advancing a model of governance and offering a form of partnership that stands in marked contrast with what our competitors are offering. Now, to be clear, many do appreciate that what USAID offers is not a sideshow to U.S. foreign policy, but rather central to it. This is why bipartisan majorities in both houses of Congress have invested unprecedented resources in USAID's expansive and expanding toolkit. This is why our teams around the world are playing central roles in trying to reach desperate civilians in places like Gaza and Sudan. It is also why President Biden became the first U.S. president to create a seat for USAID on the National Security Council. We take this responsibility seriously. And over the last 4 years, we have pursued a set of reforms to transform the agency in 3 critical ways. We have made ourselves more responsive, guiding our investments not by a set of predetermined assumptions and rules, but by what the moment demands and by what our partners tell us that they really need. We have become more efficient, maximizing every dollar we spend so that our limited resources can meet growing challenges. And we have become more catalytic, leveraging our investments to spur action and shape policy like never before. I will take each of these domains in turn. First, we are getting more responsive. Roughly 80% of USAID's missions are now in fragile and conflict-affected regions. That is really a staggering statistic when you think about it. The countries we work in also are facing massive debt, alongside serious pressure to grow their economies to provide opportunity for the next generation. They are getting battered by increasingly frequent and severe natural disasters, and they urgently need money to build infrastructure that will be able to withstand extreme weather events and absorb rapidly growing urban populations. They are seeing technology transform their economies, and they are worried about being left behind. Right now, indeed, there are 4 times as many data centers in Virginia than there are on the entire African continent. They need real partners in addressing these challenges, And sometimes USAID's ability to respond has been limited. Our funding, as you all know well, is heavily earmarked. This is not intrinsically a bad thing. These guardrails enable Congress to entrust us with the resources we deploy on behalf of the American people, and we are grateful to see the money allocated and protected for critical priorities like humanitarian assistance, specific deadly diseases, education, food security, the list goes on. But the simple fact is that the world is in a period of dramatic change, and old plans and targets and models for progress, of course, need to be adapted. The kind of programs that are responsive to current needs sometimes do not fall neatly under an earmark or a directive. So we fund them using so-called discretionary funding. But even if earmarks and directives don't go up, if they remain constant, when budgets, overall budgets, go down, as they did the past year, the discretionary resources that we draw from to be responsive shrink considerably. For example, from 2023 to 2024, these flexible resources decreased by nearly half, leaving fewer resources for discretionary programming, such as economic growth work, at the very time countries faced some of the toughest economic headwinds in recent decades, or occasionally even in their history. When we can't be responsive, our partners often turn elsewhere. And when that happens, the economic and security consequences for U.S. foreign policy and the development consequences can be dire. For example, when the PRC has stepped in to offer support, it has been almost entirely through massive loans on non-concessional terms, which has led it to become the world's largest debt holder. Now 3.3 billion people, that's 4 in 10, live in countries paying more to service external debts than they spend on health or education. The PRC is also using its partnerships in increasingly consequential ways that prioritize a narrow set of interests. For example, the PRC now controls the refining of 85 to 90% of the world's critical minerals, which are vital to national security. They've also used these partnerships to undermine democratic values. As part of the support that they have offered to help countries digitize, they've provided facial recognition software to at least 80 countries, enabling mass surveillance and targeted repression of dissidents and activists. This is not what people are asking of their governments. It is not inevitable that countries move in this direction. Indeed, PRC overreach in many arenas has produced, significant opportunity. If we are able to be partners in the new ways that countries are telling us they need, the opportunities are boundless. Congress recognizes this. In the last 2 years, we have worked with leaders in both parties to build a so-called economic resilience initiative that will surge support to countries to help them address the economic challenges that they face. Essential work if we want countries to rely less on assistance, create stability and less unrest, and build markets with more paying consumers for U.S. goods, as well as if we want to connect to supply chains for resources like critical minerals. We have begun helping countries manage debt burdens and access financing on fairer terms. This is a growth area for USAID. But already in countries like Ghana, Malawi, and Sri Lanka, our efforts are helping countries meet milestones to access IMF financing, unlocking billions in much-needed concessional funding. We are also helping countries grow their economies and create jobs by developing critical supply chains. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example, is rich in minerals that are critical for clean energy technologies. Demand for such minerals is, of course, going to increase. Estimates are that it may increase by as much as 400% just in the coming year. This is a source of potentially extraordinary economic growth for countries like the DRC. But as we all know, historically, mining is an industry where we see a lot of backroom deals, often resulting in projects that shut out responsible companies, degrade the environment, and benefit the already wealthy without benefiting local communities that are doing the hard work. So USAID recently has led the US government to develop a 5-year strategic approach to bring in more responsible investors and develop a transparent, reliable, and sustainable minerals supply chain, one that safeguards the environment, generates much needed public revenue, and if managed responsibly, one that can drive economic growth that actually reaches everyday citizens. And we are launching a new Office of Digital Technology to better support countries working to digitize their economies and increase their resilience to cyber threats. This team will help our partners invest in foundational infrastructure like last mile connectivity and access to affordable computing power, allowing them as well to digitize government services and to connect with tech companies to accelerate their digital transformations. But in a world where the number of people, for example, needing humanitarian assistance has nearly doubled in the last 5 years, where the needs are immense and growing, we also recognize that it's not enough to just pivot our focus to the most pressing needs of the day. We need to make our dollars go further. So we have no choice but to get nimbler, leaner, and smarter, evolving our approach to get the best possible results out of what are, by definition, limited resources. And over the course of the last 4 years, we have made a few critical shifts in order to do that. The first is simply reducing bureaucratic burdens. Burdens that, left unchecked, slow down work and make it difficult for others to partner with us. We cut at least 4 million hours of red tape for our own staff, and essentially, critically, we are now streamlining our processes for our partners. We've created more flexibility around reporting so that organizations don't have to have a giant stack of paperwork, sometimes in a foreign language, standing in the way of the work they want to do in their community and the ability to partner with us. At the same time, we've increased our efforts to help citizens fight waste and corruption in their own governments, elevating this work from a marginal issue at USAID to a central feature of our work. We stood up the Anti-Corruption Center, which is equipping reporters around the world to investigate ill-gotten gains across borders, and we are supporting reformers willing to hold corrupt actors accountable. These efforts have already helped to identify billions of dollars in mismanaged funds so that they can be used ultimately to benefit citizens. And knowing that resources are so scarce in comparison to the world's needs, we have undertaken a concerted effort to focus our investments on what gets the highest value per dollar. As Rachel spoke to, we created an Office of the Chief Economist for USAID to help our teams identify the approaches that are the most cost-effective. Since the office was launched just last July, this team has helped people designing programs across USAID strengthen the impact of those programs, totaling approximately $1.5 billion of taxpayer resources that have already been covered. When we identify areas with the potential for transformative change, where our investments could potentially create standout results, we are also making big bets to take advantage of them. And no big bet, I should say, comes without a trade-off, as we have learned. Let me give you an example of the kind of strategic prioritization I'm talking about. During the Cold War, one of USAID's greatest accomplishments was helping to spur green revolutions in places like Brazil, India, and South Korea, where we worked to break cycles of recurring food shortages and famines, and instead helped these nations turn themselves into major food exporters. That work continues today through our flagship food security program, Feed the Future, in other parts of the world. But the program's base budget has been flat for a decade, while global needs have continued to grow, with new shocks caused by the pandemic, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and the changing climate. Our resources were simply spread too thin across too many places to spur the kind of transformative change that we know is possible from what USAID has seen in other countries. So we asked ourselves, how do we strategically prioritize the limited resources we have to spark more green revolutions? Thanks very much to the leadership of Deputy Administrator Isabel Coleman, we identified countries where needs were high, where the farm system had the highest potential for increased production, and where the government was able to be a good partner in helping to unlock it. And now, in what we call the Africa Accelerator Initiative, we are surging $80 million into just these countries, just 3 countries, Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia. At the same time, we are using our convening power and on-the-ground teams to crowd in more resources from NGOs, foreign governments, and the private sector. Our best projections suggest that these targeted investments will sharply increase agricultural yields and hundreds of millions of dollars to these countries' GDP. What this means, practically, is that this initiative should help lift hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty. Long term, the hope is that, as in Brazil, South Korea, and India, these 3 countries will become net food exporters, helping to meet needs across their entire regions and eventually freeing up more of our resources to help others spur similar transformations. Ultimately, however, we know that no matter how strategically we deploy our own resources, the simple fact is that they alone will not be enough. After all, USAID is trying to take on poverty, hunger, illiteracy, disease, and conflict. No small tasks. So we are not content with simply making incremental progress against these challenges. In fact, one of the most exciting developments I have seen these last 4 years is the shift in mindset among USAID staff all around the world who are changing the way they work in 3 critical ways to harness our limited resources to catalyze broader change on the scale that these challenges require. So here, I want to talk about how we have become much more catalytic. First, as a design feature of everything USAID does, our staff are trying to draw in local changemakers. Local changemakers who are the ones who will keep working toward progress long after a USAID investment or an American investment or a donor investment ends. Many of these local changemakers are in fact on our own team, on our own staff. I often say that USAID's superpower is our Foreign Service nationals, citizens of our partner countries who make up the majority by far of USAID's overseas workforce. We're talking about 2/3 to 3/4 of our teams in every country where we work. These Foreign Service nationals bring decades of experience in local government, academia, and the private sector, and they are invaluable in understanding the shifts that can create truly sustained change in their communities. Over the past few years, we have undertaken a concerted effort to create more opportunities for FSN leadership and advancement across all of our missions. It is one of the least visible efforts we have made, perhaps, even to people here at CGD and in the broader development community, but it could prove one of the most important and impactful over time. Special thanks to our FSNs who are tuning in and a few who may be here with us today as part of our burgeoning fellowship program. We could not do this work without you. Just thank you so much. With the partners that we work with on the ground as well, of course, the local organizations, we are trying to shift from the top-down approaches that we often used in the past and instead are engaging with local leaders from the very beginning, the local leaders who have the deep contextual knowledge and relationships in their communities to understand the most effective levers of change. These leaders don't leave when a USAID program ends. They continue working to better their own communities. So we are increasing our outreach to these partners, expanding our use of local languages, and simplifying, again, the process of partnering with us. We are also channeling more funding directly to local civil society, government, and private sector leaders who are driving change in their communities. From 2021 to 2024, We doubled the amount of funding going to local partners. But because the number was so low to start with, that means that today, still just about 11% of USAID's funding is going to these groups directly. So we still have a very long way to go, and we can count on the people in this room holding USAID accountable as we go forward. We are also looking to reduce barriers that hinder our direct engagement with partner governments, so-called G2G assistance, which is absolutely critical, again, to driving sustainable change at scale that will continue long after USAID's initial investment. The second part of being catalytic is really seeing ourselves now as a leveraging agency, upping our focus on engaging with foundations, the diaspora, multilateral development banks, and the private sector so that we can draw in other partners who will contribute their own resources and skills to our work. For instance, companies are natural partners in development work, so much of which comes down to generating economic opportunity. Yet historically, we have not invested nearly enough in building these partnerships. So we have set out to change that. We are cultivating deeper, more lasting relationships with private sector partners, from small businesses to mega corporations. They tell us what is deterring them in a given place from investing in development priorities, and then we, working with others, try to help take down those barriers. USAID has established a first-of-its-kind fund to draw in private capital. Some of you know about this fund. It's called the EDGE Fund, and it dedicates $50 million a year to help de-risk commercial investments on behalf of development objectives. To date, USAID's $100 million of investments in the EDGE Fund have brought in more than $280 million in commitments from private sector partners, with the potential to mobilize an additional $2 billion in investments over the next 5 years. Thanks to efforts like these, from 2021 to 2023 alone, private sector partner contributions to USAID activities jumped by 42%. We have also substantially increased our engagement with multilateral development banks, who can channel resources to the problems we face, again, at the scale and with the time horizons that are required. For example, the pandemic decimated primary health systems, setting back progress on taking on infectious diseases and leaving the world vulnerable to other emerging pathogens that could spread unchecked. Governments need significant financing to rebuild these systems. So we invested in the Global Financing Facility, which offers technical assistance to countries to help them shape national strategies to improve primary health care and bring World Bank financing to implement them. Every dollar invested in the GFF connects partners with $7 more in financing from the World Bank. This is leveraging. And third, the third way we are thinking about and trying to become more catalytic is recognizing that sometimes pushing for key policy changes can yield impact far beyond individual programs. Now, I know this sounds obvious. Of course, that's the nature of advocacy. It's the nature of what even we advocate for within government, policy change. But what is so exciting at USAID is seeing a fresh cadre of so-called development diplomats who, in addition to thinking about programs and how to leverage those programs and those resources, are identifying and pushing for policy changes around the world. Over the past year, we saw a really powerful example of what's possible when we embrace this role, when we mobilized, working with people here at CGD, a diverse coalition of partners to take on an issue that CGD has been a trailblazing advocate about, this invisible crisis draining the potential of kids around the world, childhood lead poisoning. Lead claims at least 1.5 million lives every year, more than the deaths from HIV and malaria combined. Yet until this year, the typical amount of global financing for tackling lead poisoning in developing countries was about $15 million a year, the cost of a single 60-second ad at the Super Bowl. So we brought together a coalition of over 60 governments, philanthropies, multilateral organizations, and businesses with the aim of ending childhood lead poisoning in developing countries by 2040, an achievable objective. All told, the partnership that we have created has been backed now by more than $150 million, more than 10 times the current annual global investment. And even more thrillingly, members are already committing to policy changes that will truly make a difference over the long term. In the months since we began this effort, 6 countries have committed to lead paint bans. 12 countries, with a combined population of over 1 billion people, are planning to conduct blood lead level surveys so that they can identify clusters of lead poisoning and begin getting rid of the lead that is causing those clusters. And just to underscore, this is an issue for which USAID has only modest funding, but which we use these other tools, like development diplomacy and leveraging, to take head on. This is the power we can unleash when we focus on catalyzing change from partners across the world. Ultimately, however, perhaps the best example of how we can pivot quickly, move efficiently, and leverage our assistance to draw in other partners and deliver transformative results is what we have seen in response to Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So let me conclude by, again, bringing these strands together with that really, really powerful example. In the wake of Putin's full-scale invasion, it quickly became clear that he wasn't just trying to destroy Ukraine on the battlefield, he was also trying to destroy the country economically, bombing factories and farm fields and cutting off export routes to shut off Ukraine's economy from the world. In the wake of that invasion, Ukraine's economy shrank by 1/3. If the economy collapsed, Putin could have won the war without firing another shot. So we worked with Congress to surge economic development and humanitarian support, in addition to the defense support coming from DoD that one reads so much about. USAID has helped Ukraine make their energy infrastructure resilient enough to attacks to keep the lights on, the heat running, and the economy functioning through the winter, even this winter. We have stepped up to make it possible for Ukraine to access $20 billion in immobilized Russian sovereign assets, or the interest on those assets, held in the European Union by executing a complex financial guarantee that is 20 times larger than any in USAID's history. And we have worked with private sector partners to support nearly 40% of Ukraine's farmers, who power the largest sector of Ukraine's economy and make the country the breadbasket of the world, getting them the seeds and fertilizer, grain storage facilities, and safe export routes that they needed to grow and sell their food again. And because we've done this through partnerships with companies, international financial institutions, and other donors, every dollar we have invested in Ukraine's agricultural sector has leveraged over $6 from others, unlocking $2.26 billion in agricultural investments since July of 2022. Today, the Ukrainian economy has returned to growth. Grain exports have nearly returned to their pre-war levels, and exports are growing, with physical sales of Ukrainian exports increasing by 35% in the first half of 2024 compared to the same period last year. All of these developments come, of course, as the Russian ruble is collapsing and Russia's economy is in real danger, making it harder for Putin to continue the war. What we have seen in Ukraine is a powerful reminder, even in the face of daunting challenges, we can do really big things. I have emerged from 4 years at USAID more convinced than ever in the power of extending the compassion, ingenuity, and drive of the American people and of our Foreign Service nationals around the world. We do face new hurdles, but we also face them with new insights, new tools, and new partners. When I travel to the communities where USAID works all around the world, I meet people who tell me about how working with USAID has transformed their lives, helping them get the capital they needed to start a business or to recover their livelihoods after a disaster, or get the education that allowed them to pursue their goals. These people are now eager to partner with the United States to take on the challenges ahead of us. There is enormous power in the connections that USAID's partnerships have forged around the planet. And by evolving to become more responsive, more efficient, and more catalytic, we will harness this power and drive progress for a new era. Thank you so much. Thank you. Should have press anything? They're good to go. Okay. I should have said, Andrea, that maybe the measure of the recognition that USAID plays the role of ground game for U.S. foreign policy is not only that President Biden gave USAID a seat on the National Security Council, but it's that Andrea Mitchell is here moderating this conversation. So
I would say it's all of what you have done and what you bring to this. And I just want to say, as someone who has followed development for years and foreign policy, your speech just emphasizes the importance of USAID and of what you have achieved in these years. So I just want to establish that and recognize that. And that said, there are so many crazies.
can I end there?
No, just to talk about what you have done. I mean, we can start with Ukraine and what you've accomplished as someone who has followed the intensifying attacks and, all that certainly transpired when the USAID was stalemated in Congress for a critical period from probably January through May or April or even longer than that, and saw how the Ukrainian forces were forced to retreat, starting with Advika and successive attacks, and then rebounded after the surge in military aid, but importantly in the development aid. What do you see, given now the promise from the incoming president that he can resolve this? He said even within 24 hours before he takes office, but the pressure certainly is now well understood that there's going to be a negotiation, and there's going to be a lot of pressure to concede territory. And do you think right now that there is enough resilience in the Ukrainian economy and the Ukrainian political system, which go hand in glove, to withstand that?
Well, first, maybe just stepping back, because you rightly point to the delay and how unfortunate the delay was in getting the infusion of all forms of support to our Ukrainian partners. I would note, particularly in the context of an incoming transition, is that, in the end, the supplementals that were stuck for so long, I always make a note of myself so I don't get the numbers wrong, passed 311 to 112 in the House and 79 to 18 in the Senate. And we all know the complexion of both bodies has changed. Certainly Senate control has flipped. But there remains, a groundswell of support and a recognition that Ukraine is fighting on behalf of the values of independence, of democracy, of self-determination that are so cherished. And I think even the recent polling, even with the election season when so many voices were out there calling for cuts to U.S. assistance, the polling has actually held up. That's not saying the polling dictates by any stretch, what the new administration will do, but, I think that we have seen, some individuals nominated for various positions or appointed to various positions, And, some of those individuals are people who've paid many visits to Ukraine. And so the question of U.S. support is clearly an open question, including the kinds of support that USAID has provided. But that's why the $20 billion loan, alongside what the Europeans are bringing forward with $30 billion of their own, that becomes very, very important as well for Ukraine to do what it wants to do in the medium and long term, which is to be able to fend for itself. So, so I think and the loan repayments will come on the interest to the sovereign assets. So, for those, like the president-elect who are concerned about dependencies and so forth, these are loans that are going to be repaid starting at the very beginning. I think that there's no question that Putin is going all in, and the savagery of attacks. You always think that you've seen the worst, and then he manages to take a new page out of a playbook. But if you look also at what has just happened to the Russian Federation and its interests and assets in Syria, things can happen very, very in the blink of an eye that kind of can shift the balance in certain respects. Now, clearly, it was the difficulty of the fight in Ukraine that had caused Russia to pull so many assets out of Syria and left the Assad regime, above all, so vulnerable in Syria. But I think, again, these recent trends with the Russian economy, the narrative for so long was the Russian economy is so strong, sanctions haven't worked. And now what we're really seeing is these longer-term effects, including elites, a certain amount of disgruntlement and concern among elites. So my point is there's a lot that's uncertain right now, and my heart goes out to the Ukrainian people above all to live both with the incoming that they face every day and the kinds of attacks they face, but also then layered on the uncertainty, of what the coalition will look like. But President Biden, has shifted the security assistance framework under NATO's rubric. There is still strong support, of course, across the NATO alliance. And again, I come back to my first point, still really strong support across both parties here in the United States. And when it comes to the political terms, I think our argument always, political talks, our argument and our approach has always been, when Ukraine shows up for those talks on its terms, let us do everything in our power, while we're privileged to be in these roles, to ensure that they have the strongest possible hand. Those negotiations are going to be very difficult no matter what. But that is what our work for the next 40 days is predicated on. And I would expect that President-elect Trump, if he wants to get a deal when he comes into office, will also recognize that the way to get a deal will in fact be to make sure that there is mutual interest in coming to the table. And, when Putin is just letting loose and when there's uncertainty on the Ukrainian side, that is actually not going to be in the interests of getting a just and lasting deal.
Now, you've mentioned Syria, which of course is another area where there is an enormous humanitarian need. And the administration has said it has an interest in bolstering whatever governance is emerging, if they can, because they do not want Iran and others and to move in the vacuum. Similarly in Lebanon, very importantly, after the ceasefire. In Syria, there is a legal problem. You're the former UN ambassador. You know very well that Mohammed al-Jalani is on the terror list. There's a $10 million reward on his head, and we don't know which way the HTS is going to go. It is enormously, diverse coalition, to say the least, and there are elements. I mean, his own background with, Al Qaeda and ISIS, but there are so many diverse terror elements in the mix. What would you think, as an observer, to balance the humanitarian needs that will require international support, including U.S. support, with lifting that terror designation, or at least taking the reward off his head so that it can somehow be channeled to him? We faced a similar challenge with the Taliban.
Well, events are moving very quickly. Had we met last Wednesday,
We wouldn't be just talking about this.
we would not. So, I think there have not been discussions about delisting so soon after not only this lightning conquest and lightning collapse of the very brittle and never well-supported Assad regime.
NBC is reporting today that there are considerations within the administration about delisting. I interviewed John Brennan an hour or two ago, who said that he thought that, former CIA director, of course, he said that that was a bad idea immediately, that we needed to wait and see.
So, I mean, really, that is, I think you heard from President Biden directly, who spoke to this, which is that we are tracking Jelani's statements about the protection of religious minorities, about the need to preserve institutions, about he who was in Iraq and jailed in Iraq, learning the lessons of Iraq and institutional collapse and de-Baathification and all of that happening so rapidly that it left such a colossal void that only resulted in more pain for civilians. So he's saying a lot of those things, but I made the point about how quickly all of this has happened, not just because, again, the collapse was so sudden and the conquest was so sudden, but, you know, we really do need to see what unfolds here. But back to my current role, because luckily I'm an observer of sorts, but I'm also, have the privilege of working with our incredible humanitarian team to meet the needs in the here and now. And, you know, even before this, we were providing about $560 million in Syria. I mean, it's a forgotten war in terms of newspaper headlines, but it wasn't forgotten for the 1 in 2 Syrians who are relying on humanitarian assistance, either inside or outside. And, you know, we have the ability to work in territories that have been conquered or, you know, that the opposition is now in control of, whether that's the HTS or the opposition in the south or with the Kurdish forces in the SDF. So we're in there. The UN has made clear that it's staying and delivering. And, you know, part of the challenge here is expectation management. I mean, you're going to have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people returning to their homes so thrilled and relieved that Assad is gone, and then returning to homes that are occupied by other people or that have been destroyed, in the fighting over this long and awful decade. So, our job is to get in there and to work with our NGO and UN partners in territory that we have accessed over these last years and know pretty well, but also with these new opportunities presenting themselves, trying to work with those communities who want to go home. I mean, there are opportunities here that we haven't seen in the region. You know, one of my statistics, that I used is just the nearly doubling of people who need humanitarian assistance since 2019. And one of the reasons that we're up to more than 350 million people who need humanitarian assistance is that wars don't end, refugees don't go home. I mean, that has become a trademark of our time, is these chronic refugee populations. So, if we were in a position, for example, as a government or as a donor community to, where the populations in Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq, we're now returning home, the investments we make there are enduring investments. It's not just about keeping kids in school and keeping them sheltered, but it's about building the future. And that's really, for the humanitarian and the development community, such a potential, but it really will turn on not words but actions.
And we should point out that, of course, last time, during an 18-year, occupation in Lebanon, following that, when we all withdrew, the Hezbollah was created. And Hezbollah provided the needs and became part of the political institutions in Lebanon precisely because they were providing those needs and the West wasn't. So that's...
Again, engagement at the right time with the right people, but, don't underestimate as well the soft power of the ground game, that we, well and apart from questions of delisting or political engagement, USAID and its partners are already there, doing work to meet the needs of civilians where they are.
I do want to ask you about Gaza, because it is such an intractable problem getting the aid in. Twice letters, very stiff letters, have been written by Secretaries Austin and Blinken, and in this last iteration, the 30-day deadline lapsed with the secretary saying that progress was being made. But in my own count, in going to the warehouses in Jordan and watching and talking to people in UNRWA and the World Food Program, the amount is still a trickle compared to what it was before the war. And the need is just, monumental. And how do you project? I know. I'm asking you the
No, you
toughest
have to. I mean,
possible
but as well,
issues
you
around the
should.
world.
I
And
mean,
that's-
this is one of the defining issues of my time at USAID. For all of what I described, where I think we've made major inroads. This has been heartbreaking, frustrating, and for all of the high-level diplomacy and President Biden's, personal engagement on this, for all of the trips and the calls and everything that we have done with the ask list taken directly from the NGOs and UN agencies, we are where we are, which is the number of trucks, forget trucks, but the number of, food items, blankets, tents, things that people need to get through winter, is, very, very small compared to the gargantuan and escalating needs of Palestinians in Gaza. Jake is on his way to the region again. No one in this administration has given up on, the big end to all of this, where the hostages get released and Israeli forces leave population
Secretary
centers.
Blinken is taking off.
And Secretary
As soon as he
Blinken
gets out of a hearing.
exactly. So there'll be a push on cessation of hostilities. The incoming team, also has said that it's intent on peacemaking in that regard. But our focus as USAID is on just what you're talking about, the modalities of reaching people. And we have multiple challenges. We do not have adequate civilian protection by the IDF. We still need a deconfliction process that works better for NGOs and UN agencies. But also with the passage of time and the elimination of Hamas police in the IDF military operations, you now have these gangs that are just running wild. And so a lot of our challenge, there's, again, all kinds of challenges in what comes across through Kerem Shalom and other crossings, but we have, in the last months, the looting challenge, which means that even when we get trucks through that have the commodities that we need to move further afield, to Gazan civilians, a very significant share of our commodities are vulnerable to these gangs and to these looters. So we again are looking at alternative routes, expanding significantly the number of checkpoints from the single checkpoint that we had, 9 months ago, to now having 5 checkpoints, trying to be unpredictable in how we go about this. But the other need, just to really underscore the urgency of this, is the civilians who have stayed in the north, in northern Gaza. They have not been reached meaningfully in weeks and weeks and weeks. We are extremely worried about their fate. Yes, the IDF told these civilians that they should evacuate, but where a civilian stays, a civilian should be safe and should be able to be reached by humanitarian actors who are willing to put their lives on the line to reach them. So we are pushing both, again, more to get in to those in the south who are in the so-called safe zone that needs to be reliably safe, but also to reach those where they are in the north who have not been reached in far too long.
I want to bring in some questions from the audience, but I first want to ask you, because there is breaking news, that Chris Wray has told his workforce that he is stepping down as FBI director on January 20th. Clearly under fire and reluctantly, because he loves the mission, and he says he's doing it to protect the mission as best he can from being caught up in the very acrimonious debate over the people who are now criticizing it. But it gets personal with you because Kash Patel, who has been named, not nominated yet, but named to take over the agency, has written about destroying the deep state. And in his list of people on the deep state who he is targeting, you are among them. So I'm just wondering, how does that affect you going forward? How do you get your head around that after all your years in dedicated public service? And, what you and some others, including a group of women who I met with the other night who just were from the national security agencies, who were talking about whether to stay or leave and their love for public service. And how do you keep on going?
Well, I don't know. Is this one where I say thank you for the question? I'm not sure. But no, thank you for caring, as I know you do. I guess my focus is twofold right now, which is the 40 days, 39 days that I have left in this incredible role working with this incredible team of people. And just what you focused on, which is our amazing foreign service officers, civil service officers, personal service contractors, our foreign service nationals, who I gave shout-outs to earlier, our institutional support contract. I mean, just this amalgam of people who wake up every day and are not doing it for the money. You do not work in government for the money. They are doing it because they are driven by the mission that animates USAID and the mission that increasingly defines how America positions itself around the world. So, you know, of course, the statements that are made in campaigns or on blogs or whatever, you know, social media, you know, I'm less worried about my role in all of that and more, again, this amazing team of 14,000 people who leave it all on the fields every day. I will say, you know, there are inconsistencies, of course, in the form that the rhetoric takes, and you know, I think, you know, if you listen to my speech, I think a lot of what I've described USAID becoming is an agency that is very, very compatible with, indeed can be a really useful instrument for a lot of the objectives that the president-elect has put out there in terms of standing up to the PRC, you know, showing, you know, how we do things differently, looking out for American businesses, making sure that what happened during COVID, the last time he was president, doesn't happen again because we are not as dependent on one single point of failure in order to look out for the needs of the American people. So for those who are open to seeing what USAID does every day, and, you know, a lot of the people who've been named already for the national security team know USAID's work. They've seen it up close around the world. I think there's going to be a recognition that you sort of can't advance our core foreign policy and national security objectives without staffing and resourcing this agency that has enjoyed bipartisan support since John F. Kennedy, since it was created in 1963. So, 1961. Sort of the precursor, yes. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I want to bring in the audience. I think we have time for 2 questions from the audience. Let me look around. Don't be shy. I clearly wasn't.
Comments also welcome.
Yes.
I'm Lou with WildTech, and we run a program. Sorry, thanks. I'm with Lou with WildTech. We're an NGO based in DC, and we run digital equity programs in Africa. In every one of your elements aligns perfectly with the work that we do. So I'm wondering, how do we engage with you guys? You know, what's our next step for getting a conversation going based on the strategy you outlined? Thanks.
Workwithusaid.org, and then you enter. It seems a little bit impersonal, I recognize, but this is something that we've built up over the course of this administration to allow potentially new partners to engage. We also actually have individuals here that you can talk to, including my chief of staff and others, if you want to make a very specific connection. I think we have like our dream team here. We have our humanitarians, and we have a tool from Global Health and our Latin America people. So, you know, it more than the top levels, you know, to really understand where that overlap is. But actually, you know, entering into the system and beginning the interaction that way, we've had a lot of results coming out of that first connection and foray. And I will say, very specifically for small and disadvantaged businesses and for untraditional partners who, you know, haven't known quite what, you know, how to enter or haven't had the lawyers or the accountants, you know, necessarily to equip them to fill out all that paperwork that USAID has traditionally required. So I think the personal is always great, but there is actually just a gateway now to joining with USAID.
Let me see. I think there's a question there. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Martin Laney. Good afternoon. I'm the president of Alliance for Sustainable Development Foundation. It's a local organization in Cameroon. My question is, Ambassador, how far do you think we've gotten with localization, and what is the plan for the future?
Thank you so much. Well, you heard in my comments the sort of good news, bad news. The good news is, a near, I think roughly a doubling of the assistance that is going directly to local partners since we laid out that ambition at the beginning of President Biden's term. The less perfect news is just how small a percentage still of the share of foreign assistance that we provide going directly to local partners. I will say that within that 11%, the sort of more good news category, it's a significant increase in the number of local partners. So even though the awards may not be enormous, that creates a lot of growth potential. There is a lag in when we laid out this ambition and just how long it takes with the appropriations process and then the process with the State Department. So, I'm expecting those numbers to tick up, and I hope my successor to celebrate that uptick. Certainly we would have reason to believe that we'd really start to see, ourselves moving closer toward the 25%, the next year out, the year after. I would also draw your attention to something that I hope, again, the community will continue to put pressure on USAID to deliver on, which is our other commitment under the rubric of localization, which is that 50% of the assistance that we provide, and by the way, I think over time this should be 100%, but will be that the design of awards, contracts, the whole conception for prioritization will be done with local leaders and with local partners at the table. And indeed, also the evaluation of the work, the evaluation of the impact of the work, the iterations. So from conception to design to implementation and evaluation, that is something, in a way, the money, you type it into a machine and you tally where you are according to these formulas. This is harder to measure because it's a little more qualitative. And so this is where CGD's work and the work that has been done, really professional work done within the agency is going to be important. But I wouldn't, again, not to get away from the direct assistance, because we have to keep moving. 11% is not where we want to be by any means. But watch this other space as well. And we now do have metrics for that. But you will want to scrutinize those over time and make sure that we're faithful to the spirit of that idea. Third and last thing I would just say is that we are, and I alluded to this, but very, very briefly in my remarks, we recognize that when USAID, pilots something or does something effective within a Ministry of Education, the dream way this is supposed to work is we have a partnership with the Ministry of Education, and then the entire Ministry of Education, like let's say in one school district, then the entire Ministry of Education, if it's worked, picks it up and mainstreams it across whatever teacher curriculum or textbooks or, whatever, teaching at the right level, like whatever the actual program is. In Morocco, I watched this is what happened, is we did something small, the Moroccan government saw that it worked, and then next thing you knew, it was all across the Ministry of Education. Why am I mentioning that? Because we will be releasing a strategy soon on G2G, on government-to-government resourcing. This is something the Hill has ebbed and flowed on. Of course, corruption concerns in years past caused USAID to move, away from working through governments in certain parts of the world, in certain places. But, the Hill is pretty explicit about those countries that can qualify, what the criteria are. And there are a lot of countries that qualify that we are not at present doing much government-to-government assistance on. So, particularly in the public health area, this is something a tool has pushed. If we're serious about strengthening primary health care systems, working with and through governments, doing training of government officials and not just NGO workers who are making a difference, for public health outcomes, that is a trend to watch as well that I really hope picks up.
Well, we've scratched the surface. We haven't talked about Sudan and all the work that you've done in Africa and elsewhere, but it's been, remarkable, the challenge and also what you've contributed, the lead initiative that you've mentioned. I just want to thank you and know that we're going to be hearing great things from you in the future.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you for really throughout my time in government and outside of it, just always willing to lift up the human consequences of the decisions we make or the decisions we don't make, and putting issues on the radar that I'm sure your producers don't always embrace, and think are big ratings hits, but they're really important. And what you and the media writ large choose to cover is very influential when it comes to decision making. It has been for us as the Biden-Harris administration. It will be for the incoming administration, no matter what they tell you. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.